I want to start by introducing our sponsor, Steve Goodman, who's very much an active participant in the health of the healthcare startup ecosystem in New York City. And I'll tell you about that. Steve is a partner and co-head of M&A at Prior Cashman here. His clients include drug development and diagnostic companies, medical device companies, clinical trial management companies, and companies in other tech businesses. He's the chair of the Biotech Law Committee at the American Bar Association's Science and Technology Law section. You can read a lot more about him on the Prior Cashman site. What I really want to call out is that he and Prior Cashman are major sponsors of eLab for Life Science Entrepreneurs, sponsored by the NYC Economic Development Corp. And they have an incredible event, and it's going to be on April 7th. I don't know if there are tickets still available. It's in Microsoft's center, very close by, and it gives awards to amazing young entrepreneurs in life sciences and healthcare, and Steve's very much involved in making that happen. Welcome, Steve. Thank you. I mean, welcome to your office.
Well, Tammy's sort of giving you a little bit about my background. I want to welcome everyone here. I'm glad you're all enjoying the view. I saw people taking pictures, which is what many people do when they come up here. This happens to be a particularly beautiful day, so you can see quite a ways. I just want to say, I know you're not the reason, I'm not the reason you're here, so I don't want to take a lot of your time, but Prior Cashman is a law firm that is very interested in promoting entrepreneurship. We have a lot of startup and technology and life science clients. We try very hard to think the way a startup businessman, an entrepreneur will think, and we're very good at solving problems. So, and we're a full service firm. We've got 140 lawyers here, and we have expertise ranging from patent law to tax law to immigration and matrimonial and litigation and corporate, which is my area. I hope that you enjoy this program. Since Tammy's plugging all the MITEF programs, I'm going to plug a program that I sponsor through an angel group I'm part of called First Pitch Life Science, which will take place on April 19th at the offices of Medidata Solutions down on Hudson Street. We have three companies that are not quite investment ready. We let each one of them talk for 15 minutes. They get 10 minutes of Q&A from the audience, and then a panel of qualified investors will give them feedback, not like Shark Tank, where you basically they're being snarky, but to try to tell them, you know, sort of how they can improve either their business plan or their pitch, and give them, you know, very constructive feedback so that hopefully they become investable and can file an application to the angel group. So if you are interested, you can go to our website, firstpitchlifescience.com, and register for the event, and then you'll be on our mailing list and you'll find out all the good things that are happening. I welcome you again, and I'll turn the program back over to Tammy.
Thank you. Thanks again for this. This gives us a very great horizon with which to think about what we're going to be talking about today, which, I don't know, I'm the product of a lot of neuroscientists, so I find this particularly fascinating. And before we're going to, let me just check, we're doing a little bit of an odd setup because we wanted a VC perspective, because I think that we're going to delve into a lot of things that are in development, that are on the cutting edge. I won't say the bleeding edge because I was told that's gory. However, things that are happening that Malcolm Gay chronicles in his book that we're going to be talking about today. I just want to give a little plug for the power of our organization. We have an advisory board, and Meryl Unger, who's an attorney, who's sitting up front, is on our advisory board. And one of the things that our advisory board does is cues us into really fascinating things that are going on. So we said, Meryl, can we have a fascinating author, please? Could you dial one up? And she said, oh, I'll ask my husband, Henry, because that's what he does, and that's Henry right over there. And so she said, you're interested in technology and the future, and she said, Henry suggested Malcolm Gay's The Brain Electric, the dramatic high-tech race to merge minds and machines. And so I said, how does Malcolm know Henry? And so I asked, no, he was too modest, so I asked, Malcolm, how do you know Henry? And he said, he lawyered my book. So I'm not a lawyer. There's a lot of lawyers in the room. I'm not one of them. Anyway, so, and I've heard that after 6 months of, I think it was released on October 15th of 2015, roundabouts. So 6 months later, Henry's proud to say there have been no lawsuits and no copyright infringement. So all is good. So if you want to have somebody lawyer your book, speak to Henry R. Kaufman, LC. EC. LC, I am not good at these things. But anyway, that's how we got to Malcolm. And we're really, really excited. What we want to do first, because I think that, the reality of our ecosystem, of our tech ecosystem, and of nurturing entrepreneurs is that there are many ways to get funded. And I think the gentleman that's going to start us off is going to talk about some of those. I want to just keep in mind, and he reminded us that he is very much of a VC. And VCs have their own unique perspective on what makes a potential business marketable. And it doesn't include a 10-year trip through the FDA. So he's going to talk about what he calls brain tech, new to me. I've heard of med tech, fintech, he calls it brain tech. And he's going to take you through some slides that talk about a VC's perspective on brain tech. And his name is Shaheen Farshi, and he is a 10-year veteran of Lux Capital. He's out of the Silicon Valley office, which is why we're going to beam him in shortly. You'll see him before I will. He's on? Oh, excellent. Hi, Shaheen. He's in the middle of a conference. So anyway, I'll have Shaheen talk a little bit about some of the activities that he's doing, which are very, very broad. He has a PhD in engineering, so he has a lot of personal experience when he looks at some of the companies across many, many sectors. But tonight he's going to focus on brain tech. Thanks, Shaheen. And by the way, as soon as he finishes talking, we're going to be able to ask any questions that we have before we start our fireside chat. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So it's great to be here. This is my first time doing a presentation like this remotely, so bear with me. And when my slides are up, I won't be able to see you. So the goal is to keep this interactive. I wish there was a way so I could see you and my slides at the same, and share my slides at the same time. But we'll figure that out in the future session. How many of you in the audience are currently in the process of or have already started new companies? Okay, good portion. And how many of you are potentially thinking about in the future, in the near future, let's say next few months to a year, maybe starting a new company? Okay. And how many of you are just, not intending to start a company, but are just curious about startups and I guess technology in the brain? Okay, all right, good. So I guess I covered everybody. Fantastic. So to provide some background, and please, we want to make this interactive, so ask any questions whenever you'd like. But to give you some background, as was mentioned earlier, I'm with a venture capital firm called Lux. I grew up in Silicon Valley, went to Berkeley undergrad. I graduated in the dot-com bust. How many of you guys were in Silicon Valley during the bust? Not a whole lot. Well, okay, there was one or two. Okay, so you would know how terrible it was. It was really bad. There was tumbleweed going down University Avenue. And so I graduated with a computer science degree at that time. And always being a huge kind of fan of cars, I decided to go to GM, hoping the grass would be greener in Detroit. So I went over to GM, it wasn't what I was expecting. So I tried my hand at building hybrid electric cars when I was at GM, came back to California, went to graduate school, did a PhD in electrical engineering, and as part of my PhD, I developed a wireless neural interface for small animals, basically a little chip that got implanted into rats to help neuroscientists better understand epilepsy and different types of brain disease. I started a company around that, trying to sell a more kind of simplified version of the device to hospitals. I learned the hard way that it's very, very difficult to sell anything to hospitals, especially as a startup. And as a result of that, failed miserably. In the process, got to know Lux, and they asked if I wanted to join. So I joined Lux in early 2007. And at that time, I was the walking West Coast office. We didn't have an office on the West Coast. And at that time, I led a few of our semiconductor investments, and more recently did a few investments in satellites and space, driverless cars, VR, deep learning and AI. And I continue to have a passion for the brain, kind of going back to a lot of the work that I did for my PhD. Any questions on myself and Lux? And so, question to the audience
Are you still working on wireless implantable interfaces?
I'm sorry, am I still working on wireless?
Implantable interfaces?
So I am not actively working on it personally, but I'm looking for interesting companies doing stuff in that space. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. How many of you in the audience have ever interacted with a VC before? Okay, quite a few. And how many in the audience know very little about VC? Okay, all right. So just for those of you who aren't too familiar with VC, venture capitalists effectively invest money on behalf of others, and those are foundations, endowments, large corporations, high net worth individuals, and we take that money and put it to work over the course of a 10-year period with the expectation of outperforming any other possible asset class. So these people who invest in venture capital have the opportunity to invest in stocks and bonds and real estate and natural resources, hedge funds, private equity funds, buyout funds, and they invest in venture with the expectation of getting really, really fantastic returns. And the only way to get those kinds of returns is to invest in amazing startup companies that can become the future Apples and Microsofts and Googles and Facebooks of the world. So we at Lux are looking to identify those entrepreneurs that can take a modest amount of money and create disproportionate enterprise value with that money. So we're thinking that over the course of, let's say, 5 to 7 years, raising collectively, let's say, $50 to $100 million, maybe a little bit more, and building a $1 billion business. And so at Lux, we're currently investing from a $350 million fund, that's 350. And our goal is to invest in 20-25 companies over the course of the fund. And again, invest in these fantastic kind of potential outcomes. And so with every single investment that we make, our goal is to help fund that kind of next great $1 billion company, knowing that the statistics obviously show us that it's very, very unlikely to be able to hit that kind of home run. But when we get into every single one of those companies, the goal is in hopes of getting that great outsized return. So with that, I'll quickly dive into the presentation. Again, I won't be able to see you while my slides are up. And so if anybody has a question, please feel free to holler. Fantastic. So many of you may have heard about the kind of looming doom and gloom in venture capital financing. If you look at the overall trends, we're seeing that we're starting to roll off from a peak of investment activity during late 2015, and we're starting to see a little bit of a slowdown, and that's not only being reflected by VCs that are actually putting money to work, but we're also seeing that on the back end with a slowdown of M&A activity and companies going public. And so keep in mind that a lot of venture capital investments are driven by their ability to exit these companies, and when there's a slowdown in M&A and IPO markets, that kind of makes investors less kind of willing to take on the risk of funding a new company. Again, that's because of the slowdown on the back end. Now for us at Lux, since we're investing in kind of leading edge technology companies, we're looking further into the future and aren't quite as concerned about these near-term kind of effects on the markets. And so, I like to kind of put potential investment opportunities into two baskets. On the left, you see the more mainstream kind of big data and analytics, 1099 economy, sharing economy, kind of the Ubers and the on-demand delivery types of companies in the world, and kind of IoT companies. And so for those kinds of companies on the left, it's really about your actual metrics. So what kind of revenue are you doing? What exactly is your business model? What's your product market fit? Those very kind of, I would say a lot more rigor goes into the evaluation of those kinds of companies. And then on the right, you have areas that are kind of more leading edge, more nascent industries. So when we're talking about space, when we're talking about driverless cars, the future of mobility, when you're talking about brain-machine interfaces, it's really further down the road. And the question is, what kind of impact are you bringing to bear? What's the magnitude of that vision? How are you changing the world? So for those of you that are doing a lot of work, doing work on the kind of right side, I would really emphasize, again, impact on the world and how you're going to make a big change in a multi-billion-dollar industry. So to give you a sense of the areas where we invested, lots. Did you guys see the slide change, by the way?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So if you look at areas where we invested lots, on the far left you'll see the microbiome. We've done investments in drones. We've done investments in driverless cars. We invested in a number of space companies. On the top left, top right is one of the CubeSats that are being built by Planet Labs. And we're also looking at different types of semiconductor, and in fact, we recently also invested in a quantum computing company. But today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the brain and why I'm excited about investing in the brain. First of all, a lot of the press that you traditionally would see around the brain used to be limited to the scientific and academic kind of press. But nowadays, you're seeing a lot of work that's being done around the brain being shared and distributed in the business press. So, if there's a breakthrough in a lab, if there is, a funding announcement, a lot of that, again, isn't just limited to the academic community. It's being circulated by the likes of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, which implies that the business audience has taken notice of what's going on in the brain. And so you may ask, well, what are the drivers behind that? And an interesting observation here is that we're seeing exponentially more publications being done around the brain, and we're also seeing a lot of patents that are being filed and granted, again, around brain technology. That tells you that something big is coming on the way, is over the horizon as it relates to the brain. We're seeing huge amounts of money that's being allocated by the government to brain technology research. And that's obviously being distributed by the NIH, the FDA, and the National Science Foundation. So, again, if you would have asked the VC if they invest in the brain, they would have told you, yes, we invest in medical devices. But my personal belief is that investing in the brain has now gone far beyond medical devices of yore. It was probably over a decade ago when Medtronic got its FDA approval for its deep brain stimulation device. And since then, VCs have poured money into NeuroCase, which has raised over $100 million for its deep brain stimulation technology. But the interesting thing is that brain technology isn't just limited to these medical devices as they were before. And in fact, I like to categorize brain technology to three distinct areas where there's a lot of overlap as well. One around stimulation, which is not just kind of, again, the implanted devices, but also around technologies like TENS and TDCS, which is transdermal direct current stimulation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. There are technologies being developed around the brain that aren't even necessarily hardware technologies, but are apps and technologies that are driven, media that's delivered through conventional technologies, such as your iPhone in the form of apps that are being used to optimize human performance and help people meditate and, again, perform better on their day-to-day tasks. And there's all these technologies around human-machine interfaces, and I've kind of categorized that into sensing and control. We'll talk more about that in a second. Any questions so far, now that I can see you guys? Good. Keep going. So first, human performance. So a big driver behind kind of brain technology, and I would expect brain startups, is the fact that, first of all, there's a huge cultural shift towards peak human performance. So a lot of us who used to perhaps go to gyms and yoga studios now signing up for CrossFit and Ironman and these very, very rigorous kind of workout disciplines. And so my expectation is that the more we kind of trend in that direction, there's going to be more and more focus on how we can better tune our bodies and perform at our very best. And I'm not sure if any of you guys saw the news this morning, but Major League Baseball has approved 2 devices to be worn by players during games. And so that tells you that there's not only an interest, but there's also action being taken from the regulatory side, overseeing obviously sports, and sports teams that are evaluating the uses of these technologies. We're investors in a company called Halo Neuro, which is using TDCS technology, transdermal direct current stimulation, to provide surface stimulation to the brain, which is in the form of very, very weak pulses, which has been shown to increase acuity and increase mental performance. And many sports teams in a variety of different types of sports are using the technology today to train their players. Halo isn't the only technology that's doing work here. There's also Think, there is the Muse device, and there's a handful of companies that are creating applications for brain training, again, through the iPhone. And there's a company called Nutribox that's making nootropics that are effectively foods that help enhance mental cognition. So we're looking at an entirely new class of companies that are being active in the brain. The second is around education. So doing very, very simple measurements of brain activity and providing feedback, either in the form of sound or in the form of basically changing an iPad-based lesson. A couple companies are helping children with learning disabilities improve their ability to learn. So one is Brain Power and the second is Neuro Plus. Both of these companies using, again, very, very simple devices to help children with disabilities learn. Moving on, obviously many of us know, not only in the US, but in most of the developed world, obesity is a huge epidemic, or I guess diabetes. And a lot of us know now that a lot of these types of eating disorders are driven obviously by the brain. And so a lot of companies are trying to find non-invasive ways to basically not just manipulate, but also to adjust these pathways between our brain and our gut to be able to better modulate food intake and prevent these types of debilitating chronic disease that obviously cost the healthcare systems a good majority of the money that we spend on care. Obviously, entertainment is a huge area that people look at. This image that you see at the larger one on the bottom right, that's actually a person only using their brain to control a character in an online game. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to play the video here, but effectively you see the person sitting in their chair and not just using eye tracking or chin movement, but actually just thinking, are able to move the player and select weapons and fire weapons. Now the issue here is that a lot of these technologies today require a fair bit of training. So unlike a physical controller, you can't just pick it up and start using it immediately. And the core kind of research that's taking place as to how to build these things, how to define the algorithms in a way that the devices no longer need to be trained. And there's huge implications here for next generation gaming, virtual reality. There's obviously a huge market for that. And there's a couple of companies that are trying to do this as well. And we've already seen I was actually at the NVIDIA conference just earlier today before I came back to the office to see you guys. And the entire conference was driven pretty much by application of deep learning and AI. So not only for computation, but also for driverless cars, for virtual reality, augmented reality, for various types of search, for medical applications. And so it's amazing how much we've been able to achieve in various disciplines of science, basically by understanding very, very little about how the brain works. So based on our assumption as to how the brain works, extremely powerful tools have been built that have affected many, many different industries. In fact, the CEO of NVIDIA made this quote that deep learning is not only going to touch every single industry, it's going to be every single industry in the near future. And so you take that a step further and you think to yourself, well, how much more powerful kind of compute can we build if we knew more about how the brain works? So based on our very limited understanding, we've been able to do so much in terms of building amazing algorithms and computers. What more can be done if we knew incrementally more about how the brain works and to mimic that for computational systems? Is there a question in the audience?
Yes. Do you not differentiate between the brain, which is physical, and the mind?
That's a very good question. So the question is, do you differentiate between the brain and the mind? So, a lot of this work that's been done in deep learning has been based on kind of an understanding or a limited understanding of how the brain basically processes signals, input to output. So you can think of that as more as the mind as the kind of physical medium, right? So they call these systems deep neural nets. They call the steps in between neurons, but they're not active. They don't even resemble biological cells, and there's nothing to do with human tissue. You're using physical transistors, and so I guess it's using our interpretation as to how the mind works to build a physical system. And to your question, they're two very, very different things. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's interesting.
And that's pretty much everything that I've prepared for today. And I wanted to keep it brief and keep it interactive. And so I'd love to hand it over to the audience for questions.
Which of these industries do you think is the most profitable?
Good question. Very good question. And I think I would really leave it up to your imagination as far as we in venture capital aren't really in the business of pushing forward our own agendas. We are looking for entrepreneurs that can come to us with a contrarian and unique view of the world and tell us that, hey, there is a multi-billion-dollar business to be built around, for example, helping athletes perform at their best, or helping children with disabilities learn. I mean, I can't tell you right now, off the top of my head, which one of these is the most interesting, and I would hand it back to you to look at something either within or outside of the areas that we talked about right now, and find a billion-dollar opportunity. If any VC came back to you and said, oh, well, that's a small market, that means they simply don't believe in your vision, or they don't agree with your vision. And so it's a matter of coming up with a vision that, again, may not be a consensus view. I mean, if you look back at every single multi-billion-dollar company that's been built over the past 10 years, none of them had a kind of consensus kind of thesis going into it. Facebook was the 20th social network. Google was the 15th search engine, and nobody would have said at the get-go that there's another billion-dollar company to be built here. But those founders came in with a unique vision, with a unique view, and were able to deliver on that view.
Interesting. Thank you.
Gentlemen?
Question, middle.
You described a number of brain-based technologies. At what stage are these various technologies at, and how close are they each to commercialization?
Sure. So I can talk about the ones that I know more about. So in the case of Halo Neuro, the devices have been built. They're being used by people, and they're currently being used to measure performance enhancement as a result of different types of usage regimens. If you look at, for example, the stuff on food intake, and there's a few companies that are trying to stimulate the vagus nerve. That stuff is really, really early. It's in the conceptual stage. There's probably animal trials going on. So I would say that the stuff that you see here in this presentation, maybe on the human performance side, a lot of this technology is pretty far along. It's more simple technology. It's already been built. It's more about the application that's being investigated. On the educational side, I mean, this is off-the-shelf stuff. It's Google Glass and an off-the-shelf EEG sensing or Surface EEG sensing device. These are all, again, off-the-shelf technologies that are pretty mature. This stuff, you know, and all the biomedical stuff is extremely early. These technologies, again, are off-the-shelf technologies. And this is bleeding edge stuff. I mean, this is Ted Berger from USC's work, kind of doing these brain mimicking computing devices that are, I guess, you know, science fiction still at this point. They're very, very academic, researchy. So I would say that the actual stage of technology in this presentation runs the gamut from, you know, ready to hit the market, you know, yesterday, all the way to, you know, super academic and theoretical.
So as you know, Google's Ray Kurzweil, his head of engineering and artificial intelligence, has made some pretty ambitious projections about human computer-brain interfaces and where that's going in the future. He thinks that we'll be able to kind of access the internet from our mind, and that if we need to like say something smart, we'll be able to kind of download more bandwidth into our mind so we can say something smart at the right time.
Get me one of
This
those.
is Ray Kurzweil. He's from Google and has dozens of patents to his name.
He's an optimist.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you heard some of these predictions. Do you think, you know, they are possible? Do you, or kind of more immediately, have you seen companies that are trying to create a direct connection from the brain to the internet, so like I could browse the web in my mind, so to speak? I don't know.
Yeah. So there's obviously the science fiction view, which is basically you know, you kind of stand there and you just, you know, you start searching Google without any kind of external device. But I feel like this is part of what you described already exists in the form of VR, right? So if you wear a VR headset, then you can basically, you know, navigate, go to a city, go to another city, go to another room, sit down and have a conversation with somebody. It's not exactly interface with your brain directly. It's using your eyes and ears and your senses. I mean, there's companies that are making fans that will blow air in your face to basically kind of, you know, create a more immersive VR environment. If you're like outdoors, there are devices that are making odors, so you smell things depending on where you are in the virtual environment. So I think VR is taking us a step in that. I mean, first of all, I agree with you, with Ray, I guess. I mean, we're gonna eventually get there. I guess the way we get there is probably a little bit more progressive. I don't think there's going to be chips implanted into every infant's brain as soon as they're born so that they can access the web without a phone. But you know, today it's probably the VR devices. Tomorrow there's probably going to be a little earpiece that we put into our ears. I mean, that was the vision behind a lot of these Bluetooth headset companies. A lot of them, you know, said 5-6 years ago that they want to use this earpiece as a window to the web. And so you basically talk into it Siri style, and you're able to pull up information through voice entirely. Now the question is, well, then how do you see it? Well, then maybe you can wear glasses and see if that technology isn't quite there yet. So, you know, I think we're going to get there. So it's probably going to take a little bit longer than we think. And we may get to a point where that entire technology becomes completely, you know, redundant. Maybe we'll get to the point where we don't need to kind of surf the web, you know, through our heads. There's going to be some other kind of communications or search paradigm where the internet no longer makes sense. But who knows?
Janine, thank you so much. If we give him a round of applause. On target and a perfect setup for tonight.
Thank you for organizing this, and really great to be here. And I'm glad that it worked. And I know we had a little hiccup earlier. It takes us some time to get presentations on our conference room screen, so the fact that we got this going within like 3 or 4 minutes, I think was a huge miracle.
It's a testament to karma and your intelligence. Thank you so much. Take care and have a great rest of the conference. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah, you guys can see.
We'll send you the videotape so you can catch the rest. Okay? Thank you. Take care. Okay, everybody. That was awesome. I just want to start by introducing the Fireside, the moderator and the speaker, the author this evening. There's no words to describe Wynn because I've just met him through Christina Dolan and Jocelyn Shire, who was originally going to be in this role, but she's ill. The three of them were students together at MIT. Wynn is a professor of nursing at NYU. Before that, he was in Arizona in an engineering capacity. He's a social entrepreneur. He owns many patents, many awards. He is, if there's a Renaissance title to be given in science, engineering, and futuristic endeavors, I think they're, if you read, everyone got one of these, so I can't possibly do justice to the range of sectors. There's a section that says in the NYU curriculum, what sectors is he interested in, and it's mind-blowing, the diversity, and this happily is one of them. So I think he speaks from many, many perspectives and is highly inquisitive, and and Malcolm and he have talked back and forth, and Malcolm is a very well-respected arts writer for the Globe and formerly for the New York Times, and this is his first book, and that he chose to delve into and write a book that is as brilliant as this, for those of you who have read or heard it, that delves so deeply into a domain that is mind-bogglingly complex and very, very varied in terms of the kinds of solutions that are out there, both invasive and non-invasive. The fact that he has mastered this domain and told these stories in such a compelling way, I think is why Henry told him, go! So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Wynn Burleson and our esteemed author, Malcolm Gay, for a fireside chat. Imagine the fire. Thank you so much. And we have some audio-visual constraints. We are here at the MIT Enterprise Forum to overcome technology constraints. So we're now going to mic up Malcolm, and Wynn is going to scream because we have one mic, okay? So imagine that Wynn is usually a very gentle voiced person, and tonight he's going to project. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammy. It was wonderful. Thank you, Malcolm.
My pleasure.
Pleasure to have you here. Just wanted to kick this off with maybe you can describe. We've heard a little bit from Dean about his perspective of the future and fundability of this area. Maybe you can take us back a little bit to what are some of the core areas of BCI and how you got interested in this and what you found as you delved into this area.
Mm-hmm, sure. So what he was talking about is largely wearables, things that are external to the brain. The area, it's a huge field, as you can imagine. People are working in memory, people are working in vision, people are working, in motor, people are working in sense, all sorts of things. So one of the big questions for me as a writer, I wanted to write a book that, I as a non-expert would want to read. And so I was looking for kind of a narrative structure. And I was looking for one, the most exciting research, and two, kind of characters to animate, kind of a narrative space for the book. And so, it became clear to me fairly quickly that, the most esteemed, most, successful neuroscientists were really working in motor at that point, and they were working in motor. And so to access that, there are three real technologies that people are working with. There's EEG, which is a lot of what we saw just now, and then there are two other more invasive forms of BCI. The first is ECOG, or ECOG, and that's an actually implanted grid of electrodes that sits on top of the brain. And then the second is single unit, or really invasive electrodes, where the electrodes will pierce the brain and sidle up next to neurons. What that gives you is incredible clarity. You're in a direct conversation with the actual individual matter of the brain. And that's the area that when you see these kind of extraordinary movements of robotic arms and things like that, those people are using that type of very invasive imaging.
Amazing. You're suggesting that the field is very broad. It obviously is. It takes a certain amount of transdisciplinarity, and often we see that transdisciplinarity is a challenge because of the silos that people are coming from, the different perspectives, the blind corners, if you will. Can you give some insight as to how these innovators navigated that space and how that led them to their capacity as preeminent individuals in their fields?
Usually it's multiple labs working together. So for instance, in the Revolutionizing Prosthetics program, which I document the book fairly at length, I'm kind of interested in the neuroscience and kind of what the neuroscience of movement really allows us to do. But that program, I think, had 33 separate labs in it, more than 400 researchers. And so you had people that were working in cosmesis, you had people that were working in neuroscience, you had bio engineers, you had all computer scientists. It ran the gamut. There's no one person that can say that can put together a brain-machine interface at this point. Everything was really kind of put together by a group of individuals who were working toward the same goal. But I mean, what that took, I think, was in the case of revolutionizing prosthetics, was a very, very clear goal on the Department of Defense's side. They had it was at the time it was run by a guy named Jeffrey Ling, who was a real force of nature, and he told me at one point, if anybody starts to stray, I put them back on the market. He's former military, and he would shut these scientists down. So he was very, but it took that kind of almost dictatorial vision to put this thing together.
Right. Was it that the Shanghai arm existed before Gary Ling's projects?
The Shanghai arm.
So can you maybe map that trajectory where Shanghai arm and all the way back to the early work was it 1800s when the dentists were working to figure out how to do these first implants, largely around the prosthetics. So just in terms of the Revolutionizing Prosthetic program.
One of the things, and this is, he didn't talk about it so much, but one of the questions about prostheses just generally is why the upper limb is so difficult and why tackle the upper limb. In a lot of ways, it's not a very natural decision to go after the upper limb. The lower limb is where most people have amputations, and in a lot of ways, it's a much easier limb to recreate. The upper limb is much more difficult. I mean, the average human arm, I think, has 27 degrees of freedom. And so what most people have been left with is the kind of traditional pincher with a strap where you kind of maneuver it with your shoulder. It's an incredibly difficult engineering challenge. Prior to that was really the first kind of interactive upper limb prosthetic that we actually had. Prior to that, they were iron fists and wood stumps and hooks, and it was it was what you'd imagine it to be. So that was kind of the beginning of that's an early 20th century technology, the hook and cable prostheses. It then moved into more motorized prostheses that were using myoelectric, and that is that's a non-neural control mechanism, but what it's using is the electrical impulses that are coming off the muscles. But the problem with that was that you could have very, very limited range of what you could do. What happened with DARPA was I think that Ling himself, he was really kind of the driving force behind this, came out of Iraq and Afghanistan and saw these young vets who were coming back because of body armor alive, but amputated the upper limb, and there was a real drive on his part to make these kids whole. That was really his driving force. And the only way that he saw, that the people at DARPA, most people that are working in BCI saw as the only logical control mechanism for that sort of an engineering feat of an upper limb was to actually mimic the natural appendage and link it to the brain.
So in this space, DARPA's made this great advancement, and you were talking to me earlier this afternoon about the further advancement that they made since the book came out, that they now have a interface to a large part of the body. Maybe you could share with us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, that was one of the things that I was, I was saying that I wanted kind of a narrative space for the book. One reason I wanted to do that was that this field is moving so fast. This is a lot of the people that I was working with are working on startups. They're working on trying to commercialize this, and they're looking for people that are venture capitalists, oftentimes unsuccessfully. But what they're trying, but what I didn't want it to be was just a compendium of all of the research that's going on right now. When I was working on the book, they were working on motor control for the arm. The arm itself actually can bring on sensory, can actually deliver sensory feedback to the brain. And at this point, that's where they're working. They've actually, DARPA recently announced that one of the labs that they're working with was able, the research subject was able to determine every finger that was being touched, and they were able to determine that at 100% accuracy. And it's subjective. It's what the research subject was saying, but the research subject, reported that what they were feeling felt like when they would actually touch their finger, which is quite something. When you're dealing with an upper limb, it's one thing to be able to move it, but to be able to move it with intelligence, the limb has to be able to give you feedback. It has to know where it is in space. You need a sense of proprioception, but you also need to know if something's hot, how hard you're actually gripping something. There are all of these other sensory feedback that allow you to maneuver an arm with real intelligence.
On that movement aspect, in the book you cover studies that show that monkeys can reach out with a rake and how that gets sensed and appropriated as part of their appendage. So the rake becomes, at least for the moment or while they use it, a prosthesis, if you will. Likewise, you talk about a cursor being also adopted by individuals and a specific form of adaptation that goes beyond the notion of how you control your own body, but an adaptation. And then beyond that, we have the whole world, right? We can control the Google car or computers around the world, potentially even other brains.
Yeah.
So can you explore with us some of the core concepts in this embodied cognition and how that relates to where our body stops and what we want to have influence on?
Sure. So one of the more amazing things that I found in reporting this book was it's probably best illustrated by the research that you were talking about. But basically what they did was while monitoring brain activity, they gave monkeys rakes, and then there was a screen in front of them with a small gap at the bottom of the screen, and there was food on the other end of that screen. And what they allowed the monkeys to use the rakes. That was the only way they could actually get their food reward. And they kind of allowed them to habituate to the rakes. They then took the rakes away and touched the monkey's paws and saw where in the brain and how the brain was reacting to that. Then gave them back the rakes and let the monkeys eat some more. And then they started fondling the rakes themselves. And the monkeys had the exact same reaction to the rake being handled as they had to the paw being handled. The implication being, of course, that the monkey had actually taken on board this tool to be part of itself, and it had become, it had actually come to embody its tool on its own. It had become one in the sense of the tool. That's a really, to my mind, that's an extraordinary finding, not only in that, when we think about, when a lot of people are using a BCI, they're thinking move up to the right, or they're thinking clench my fist. What this is actually allowing the brain to do It's adapt to the algorithm, adapt to the computer. So it really does become kind of a union of these two.
So where does that stop? I mean, if we can control our bodies and then control other interfaces, is that sort of the futuristic scenarios that we were talking about?
Yeah, conceivably. Conceivably, there is no stop to that. I mean, I think that one of the things that this technology, and I should say, I'm not, there are a lot of people that get really excited about the science fiction element of this, and I think that there is, that's out there and it's a possibility, absolutely. But one of the things that this does present is, a radical rethinking of what the human body is and kind of what we have traditionally thought of biologically as the end point of our body. If we're actually able to take on these new modalities and take on, understand the infrared spectrum, or hear radio signals that otherwise would be completely silent to us, or access the thoughts of another person, and kind of have some complementary consciousness. What is it that actually emerges from that? These are questions that I think can fundamentally redefine what our experience is as humans. In that regard, the sky is sort of the limit.
So this technology and its outcomes are redefining our potential, and the sky's the limit. But to actually advance that, these innovators in their various labs are also redefining their own conceptions of how some of these underlying philosophies of how the brain works. You mentioned a number of paradigms of the way the brain was conceptualized and how they changed that paradigm with a new technology or an implementation. Could you cover one or two of those in terms of how they had the neurostimulator paradigm, and then they sort of turned it on its head and embraced that as they moved across these three areas of BCI?
Right. Well, so I think that what you see, kind of in the market now, in the market that we see around us, there are off-the-shelf EEG headsets that we can buy. There are neural stimulators that are external to the brain that have been shown to increase cognition. They've shown, the Army has shown snipers to become much more accurate after having this therapy. There are, the idea being that what it allows the brain to do is become more fluid and more kind of agile in its ability to fire and to function. And so that that has tremendous applications in terms of not only physical performance but mental clarity. People are using it for sensations of wellness and peace. Those neural stimulators are, I would say that that's when you start saying how large the actual field is. It's sort of outside of what is traditionally BCI. But there are neural stimulators in terms of deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease, epilepsy. But interestingly, one of the guys that works with epilepsy, they have there are two electrode leads that go to the area of seizure focus and will actually override the beginnings of a seizure. One of the guys that was deeply involved in that is now working on external stimulators. And I think that's an important thing to realize. Because dragging that through the FDA process was Herculean, I believe. Where the guys that I really concentrate on in the book are working, mainly invasively. They're mainly working with, trying to actually unleash the brain onto the world. Not necessarily, stimulate the brain to. In some cases they are in terms of memory and in terms of vision. But really, what they're trying to do is to, allow the will to kind of exist in the digital realm, and that's really kind of what these guys are excited about. When it comes to moving that to the next phase, that's the big stumbling block.
So in terms of the near-term market and some of the drivers, we saw that the upper arm prosthetics were not a sufficient market, and that's why DARPA needed to step in and make whole some of the soldiers and individuals that were coming back with these traumas. That now potentially becomes a platform that can be used more broadly. Can you tell us about the work in the epilepsy and the seizure, which are or were more fundamental drivers of profitable or markets that were largers?
Well, I actually think that the market that the people that I was
or stroke, sorry,
stroke. That's where they're really most excited. I mean, when you get into, one of the things that happened with DARPA was they weren't ever able to find venture capitalists who were willing to take it, through FDA approval. And so DARPA has held on to the Revolutionizing Prosthetics program. Stroke is a much larger market, and there are millions and millions of people that are involved in stroke.
800,000 victims a year.
There we go. Yeah, no, it's a huge.
They're not. They run the gamut from across age, 800,000 a year.
And so, the researchers that I was working with that are working on a startup, Eric Luthard is working with a group called Neurological, and basically what he's been able to find is that whereas when you have a stroke, you usually have some sort of weakness on the contralateral side of where the damage caused. He was able, using BCI, to develop a technique to find motor intention on the ipsilateral side, so the same side of the healthy side of the brain, and use that to control an orthotic limb. That orthotic limb is used as a rehabilitation device. So it wouldn't actually be BCI as some sort of new arm that would that the stroke victim would adopt, but it would be a rehabilitative tool that would actually train through the features of neuroplasticity the ipsilateral side, the same side of the brain, to learn to actually control the weaker side of the body. And that, they've actually had quite a bit of success attracting venture capital for that. But that's the area where people are looking at implanted, work that could actually move to into a commercial product. The key to that, of course, is that it gives you a sense that you're actually, it bridges a believability gap, I think. The idea that you've had a stroke and you've undergone a craniotomy and a basic brain surgery for rehabilitation, I think is a very tall order for a lot of people. But if you can actually show that it has these benefits, then you can actually really find some funding for it.
Can you talk in a little bit more detail about the nature of the three types of technologies and what they are and what their benefits or limitations are?
Sure. So EEG is, I think probably everybody in the room knows EEG. It is, you can buy off-the-shelf things. Right now, when we're looking at people playing video games, they're using the EEG headsets and things like that. That doesn't give a lot of clarity. It's kind of like listening to a symphony from behind the band shell. You can kind of hear kind of big movements, but also the signals are often corrupted by the muscles in the scalp, and will not actually allow you to really be able to really clarify intention. The other problem with that I've found is that instead of if I wanted to have an avatar, say, move its arm up and to the right, I couldn't just think move up and to the right. Using these sorts of technologies, you usually have to think, flex my fist, or make some kind of gross movement that's not necessarily related to the subtler movement. So all of a sudden you have to have this whole dictionary of distinct movements that aren't actually related. So it becomes a more difficult interface. The next kind of step, what some people would call the Goldilocks zone, is ECOG, which is it's a grid of electrodes that is placed below the dura mater, which is the skin that goes over the leather-like casing that goes over the brain, and the electrodes sit directly on the brain. That uses pooled neural activity, not unlike ECOG, but what it gives you is a lot of clarity in in the actual signals themselves, which is really important because you actually know what you're working with. It's also been found to be very stable. That's where the kind of the adherents of ECOG would say these signals will last. Not only are they clear, but they'll last for a very, very long time. The gold standard is invasive are invasive implants, and these are the implants that go 1 or 2 millimeters into the actual brain matter itself, and are listening into individual neurons. And what those give are incredible clarity in terms of neural intention. The problem that they have is that the brain abhors this, any sort of foreign matter, and starts to, bring proteins and it will encapsulate the actual electrodes, and that will, so what that means is that 3 months, 6 months, no one really knows. It kind of depends. The implant will fail, and it will fail again and again and again. So this is one of the huge basic problems that these guys run up against all the time. So they need material scientists to try to figure out. That's what I was saying. It's never just a neuroscientist.
Right.
You need people that can.
They're going to the roboticists,
right,
the
exactly.
biochemists, the implantable
Precisely.
Materials.
But so those are kind of the three, and that the last is where people have found the deepest and kind of have kind of gotten the most traction.
You touched on the third one, particularly about the challenge that the individual with the condition faces in this context. The person not only has a stroke or an epilepsy or another condition that they want to address, but it's hard to understand what technologies are available, how well they're going to work, how much rejection there will be in those. Could you share with us one of those stories of somebody seeking these solutions and some of the sort of personal trauma that they, either it working or not working?
Well, yeah, one of the things, just in terms of reporting the book, one of the things that I found most moving were some of the patient volunteers. These are people that, for the most part, aren't going to really receive any sort of real benefit from this in their lifetime. And I think most of them know that going in. But one woman in particular that I worked with, before she came on the study, she was raised Catholic and had this real strong sense of duty, and that she wanted to be of service to other people. And when she lost her ability to move, she lost her ability to help other people. And this kind of gave her, a real sense of being able to give back and to renew that. One of the things, there's always that story that you miss. But one of the researchers, he was actually one of the first guys to ever implant a human. Soon after I published the book, he traveled to, I believe it was Belize, to implant himself. Because he couldn't get approval to implant his patients. And so he went down to Belize and had a surgeon there implant these electrodes that he directed him where to implant them. So people are very excited about this, and they have a lot of expectation that it can move places. He also had to have those explanted, I think, within 30 days. It didn't end well.
There was another story that you told in the book of individuals hooking up multiple organisms to rats that were then able to share memories to create a sort of super brain. Could you share with us that story and how that might relate? Again, this is going back maybe over towards the area of science fiction, but this is the beginning of something that's actually happening in the lab. And maybe there's cultural aspects to those researchers in terms of how accepted that approach is, sure. And that also probably has implications for the VC that wants the way out there idea versus the government that might want some of the more mainstream ideas.
So there are, one of the things that drives the book is the rivalry among labs. Everybody wants to be kind of the first to really unlock the brain. One of the researchers that I'm working with, who's is one of the main faces of the field, has been working on he calls it a brain-to-brain interface. And what he does is he uses multiple brains, and so he'll have one animal that is, kind of what he calls the encoding animal, and that animal will perform an action. Maybe it's getting a food reward or whatever it is. He'll then take those neural signals, run them through his algorithm, which is how how the BCI works, and then stimulate a second animal. That second animal will then perform that action. If the animal performs that action correctly, they'll both receive a reward. If the animal performs it incorrectly, the initial animal will not receive the reward either. At that point, the brains will actually start to become more efficient in how they're interacting with one another. It's basic stuff, but it's problem solving across multiple brains. And he's interested in this, I think, not necessarily because he wants to build a better robotic arm. He's interested in it because he wants to push the limits on how we think about who we are and what the brain is capable of. If the brain, which I think has been shown, is able to take on these new modalities, how easily can the brain absorb the consciousness of another brain? How do you start to determine what your thoughts are? I mean, if you're in this networked, cyborg network of computers and other individuals, how do you know where these thoughts will actually originate? Or do the thoughts actually kind of become a larger emergent cognition that we can't quite get our heads around at this point? I mean, what does that start to look like? If there's an emergent consciousness that arrives from the linking of 3 or 4 separate animals, we don't even know what that looks like.
I heard a story from some of my classmates at the Media Lab who were working with a professor there, Sandy Pentland. They were some of the first cyborgs. They were in the late 90s wearing heads-up displays and backpacks, batteries, computers, even certifying themselves as mobile television stations. And they were so similar in some respect to all this new experience in their cohesive group. They did a little experiment where they decided not to label the records that each of them put into the note-taking, into the database. So when they went back into the database, they claimed to have phantom memories, that they could actually see themselves having said something or being part of a meeting that they were not able to attend, but because they were so immersed in this and had sort of a collective intelligence of the kind that you're talking about, this is sort of, there's an element of BCI in that our technologies are on our bodies and they're so immersed with our everyday life that connectivity is becoming more and more cohesive. So that's sort of bridging some of this experiential world experience. Similar to maybe those early dentists or individuals working with prosthetics.
There's another guy who's working. He's an artist. He's really interesting, but he's the first. I believe he's from Belgium, maybe, or the Netherlands. But he is. I think his passport. He's the first person to be listed as a cyborg.
Right.
And he is colorblind. He's naturally colorblind, but he has an implant, and the thing kind of comes up over his head. It's almost like a horn. And what it allows him to do is feel color. He's kind of a digital synesthete, where he can actually have, he can not only, experience the color realm, but he experiences it, in kind of emotion and feeling. I've
seen
so there are new
talk as well.
He's done some. One other area of work that Miguel is working on, who's the guy that's working on this kind of brain-to-brain interface, is bringing in other areas of the light spectrum. So he's allowed rats, I believe monkeys, to experience the infrared spectrum, and kind of bringing on new senses that we previously were unable to have. These are animals that are making meaningful distinctions and meaningful decisions based on information that they would not naturally be able to have.
And then there's another artist, Stellark, who has looked at how electrodes implanted on his body can be used to drive his body, not necessarily by himself. So he's done an experiment where he's standing on one of his legs and he has all of his other appendages electrode, and put those electrodes available on the web. So he's done a 2 to 4 hour stint at this. So you can look this up. He also then created a third arm, a robotic arm, and then went to maybe Belize or another country and had a small ear
He's the guy that had the ear on them. Yeah.
implanted on his forearm. So looking at these, which gets back to that appropriation of the brain, that idea. Maybe you could just elucidate that idea a little further. The importance that the brain is plastic enough that it can remediate some of the stroke aspect, even when one side of the brain is. Can you drive home that point about the what was the term for the two-sided?
Well, there's ipsilateral versus contralateral. I think that what it speaks to is, you know, the plasticity of the brain not only being able to, you know, kind of heal itself, so to speak, you know, when it comes to something like stroke, and learn these new modalities. But I think what BCI is showing us in a lot of ways is that, you know, the plasticity of the brain means that, you know, I think someone over here asked about kind of allowing Google to be in the brain. It gives us, well, but I mean, I think it gives that, it makes that not necessarily, I mean, it's a long way off, but it makes it not necessarily an impossibility, because all of a sudden the brain is not, you know, confined to, I mean, 100 years ago, we thought that the brain was, you know, we thought that there were specific areas of the brain that were related to specific things, you know, and that holds to a certain extent. But you know, there are individuals who have been able to process vision in the sensory cortex, not the visual cortex. So the brain can actually learn to see in different areas. You know, so instead of, you know, whereas, you know, we previously thought that we had this kind of fatalistic vision of the brain where, you know, there was one area, and if that area was damaged, that was it for, you know, for vision. You know, there's another technology out there that's again for blind people, where you place a pallet on the tongue. It's not a direct neural interface, but what it does is it stimulates. It uses a camera to scan the room, a processor, and then there are electrodes on a pallet that goes on the tongue, and that will stimulate in a pattern that the brain will start to understand as vision. And so depending on how you're, you know, kind of moving around a space, you'll be able to navigate that space as a blind person, sighted through your tongue. You know, and the brain is not making that distinction. You know, people have used this to climb 14,000 foot peaks. You know, it's not. I mean, it's you know, so there is. I mean, it gives us a different sense of what's possible.
It reminds me of the experiment where you wear glasses that make the world look upside down.
Upside down.
And it takes you 6 to 8 hours to.
And then you're okay.
And then when you take them off, it takes another conversion. So that kind of, and the idea about the ipsilateral concept is that if this happens to a person with a stroke, that part of their brain, half their brain, or a portion, one side, has suffered and is no longer able to control the opposite side's arm.
Which naturally it would,
right. And so if you want that side's arm to be controlled, the advantage of the plasticity is that the same side as that arm, which normally doesn't control that arm, can now be used because of the plasticity to control that arm. And so that's sort of the promise of finding the plasticity and the ipsilateral nature.
Right, and that's actually only really been shown in ECOG, which takes, you know, these large areas of the brain and can take intention off of that area. That's where that area has been found.
Before we open it up for some questions from the audience, I wanted to ask, so after this project, what does this make you think in terms of, you know, so how has this changed your perspective of the world, and what do you see as your next major project? You got your day job and you're doing wonderful work there, but what's next?
Well, so, I mean, I'll take it in two parts. I mean, the thing I think I had very kind of simple ideas of kind of perception and how I thought about the world, and after kind of diving into the brain, you know, I think I am much more skeptical of my own impressions. I don't trust myself as much, honestly. Like I don't trust that what I see is actually what's there in a lot of ways.
And put on the upside down glasses.
Right. I mean, who knows? I may have them on now. You know, I mean, that's kind of that's one of my big takeaways is that a lot of our perceptions are primed by our
so going back to Plato's cave and the shadows.
Absolutely.
How much of this is real and
right.
what part is being processed by
and
him.
how much? Well, I mean, there are all sort of studies that you see out there where people will not be able. I mean, there's a classic. There's the classic. Basketball and bear study. Where you've got. Are you all familiar with this study? I mean. They'll show there'll be 8 or 10 people passing a basketball around, and the prompt will be watch the basketball. And so you're how many times is the basketball passed? And so you're sitting there and you're counting the basketball, and then it will end up and it'll say how many times did you see it? And of course everybody gets how many times it was passed. And then it says, and did you see the dancing bear? And there's a large portion of the population that never sees the dancing bear that walks in the middle of the screen and is like dancing, and no one's the wiser because we're very task focused, and so we see what we expect to see, and that's what I mean by not trusting my
Professor Blasikovich at UC Santa Barbara was former president of the American Psychological Association. He has a saying that it's all virtual reality. And he's moved his
so true.
He's moved his work to the virtual world with interactions with virtual characters rather than other humans because they're more controllable. You can do more repeatable studies on humans with these in the virtual space. So as we move into the VR and AR at NYUX, we're developing a holodeck. Getting some of these multimodal reality elements fused between the audio, the visual, the physical, haptic, the social, the collaborative, co-located, and the distributed. Putting those pieces together so these can become platforms that we start to question. Where are the glasses? Are they upside down? Are they sideways? Are they upside down? So you can see the world in
Where is that PowerPoint?
It's been a wonderful pleasure. I want to share this pleasure with others in the audience and have some questions.
So, as we have seen, science fiction oftentimes comes science back. And as someone interested in philosophy of mind and indefinite life extension, I have to ask this to you. We're talking about prosthetics right now and limb replacement, but what about full consciousness upload into a remote server? And piggybacking off of that, possession of a robotic body or multiple mechanical processes. Do you think that that's possible?
Let's hold it there and see what he says.
So
yes or no?
I think so. I mean, you're aware of the. I mean, there's the Russian billionaire who's working on uploading consciousnness and all of that. Good luck on that.
I know, right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a very. I mean, one thing that there's one of the jokes that neuroscientists love to use to illustrate this is you're walking down the street and you see a drunk guy and he's like he's fumbling around under the street light and you ask him what do you I don't know if you know this but he's saying what are you looking for? He's like I lost my keys and then you go on your way and then you come back an hour later and the guy's still under the spotlight and he's looking around and you haven't found your keys yet and he says no, why don't you look somewhere else? And he says because this is where the light is. And the idea being that when you're looking at the brain has billions and billions and billions of neurons, and if consciousness is some sort of emergent component or emergent quality that emerges out of this interaction of these billions of neurons, and we're looking at 200, 300, 1,000 of them. We have such a parochial vision of the brain that the idea that we'd be able to upload, understand consciousness and then take the next step and upload it somewhere else, that's maybe someday, but I don't think I'll live to see that. I mean, unless there's life extension. But the other thing, I mean, in terms of avatars, I think avatars are actually, I think simplistic avatars are actually kind of there. I've seen people use BCI in areas like Second Life. People who would be otherwise motor impaired can live, kind of fuller lives, or not, or active, I mean, their virtual lives. They're not actually, deriving sensation from this, but they're able to move around and go play tennis in their virtual world.
On the closing of that loop, there's also efforts to embody those avatars with the full body of written work or scholarship that individuals have produced, either their words, their dialogue. So not going from can you sense the cognition and translate it into another brain, but can you sense the cognition from the output of that person's life work or their videos or their mannerisms, and then load it into a personification of them, either an avatar or a humanoid robot that might one day give a semblance of what they could be.
We're talking about that a lot. That's like a lot. Yeah.
There's a question back here, and then up here.
Sort of on that science fiction track here. How long do you think it'll be before we have that sort of matrix-like interface, where you will have that way to be able to immerse and have all the cognition in the virtual world without having to do with any apparatus? An interface in your brain.
Where we can sit in the little pods of pus. Enjoy the humidity.
But is there an idea in your mind that there would be some way to get all the feedback and information into your brain through an interface of some kind, so that way you don't need any apparatus at all, it just goes directly into your brain?
Wow. I think I think that's perhaps possible. I mean, I think that for all the talk we've had about neuroplasticity and those questions, I do think that there are very distinct regions of the brain that you need to be able to access. So kind of a one-stop shopping neural interface would be kind of a tall order. And the other thing is that one of the things that we're finding is that, unlike these kind of siloed areas where, this is where my motor strip is, and here's where I see, and all, the brain is this deeply networked environment. And so you have, so the idea that you would be able to locate it with one implant is maybe a bit much. If there's some sort of broader implant, that's possible. But again, what we're talking about. I mean, one of the guys that I'm working with, or that I work with, has been able to create digital memories. And so what he does is he disables the hippocampus, which is a brain structure that's essential to memory. And basically, what he's created is what he believes is kind of a meta algorithm for memory, and he can stimulate. So what he'll do is he'll disable that, and then he'll stimulate the areas where the hippocampus would normally be off-putting memory. And he's been able to create real memories in individual rats and individual monkeys, where they can, where they have no functioning memory and are able to find these things. But that's a long way from the Madeline moment. That's a long way from being able to recall childhood or something like that. I mean, it's very, very specific, targeted stuff. So, I mean, I would kind of say it may happen at some point, but I don't know how it's.
So there's been this rise of do-it-yourself hackers, and I was wondering if you could comment on, for example, transcranial direct current stimulation, where you put electrodes to stimulate certain parts of the brain to try to improve performance. I know that there was a recent kind of groundbreaking study on pilots and improving pilot performance, like new pilots.
Yeah. I mean, it's been very. I mean, it's been shown to be quite effective.
So, I guess my second question then is, how far off until that kind of can go more mainstream? And secondly, what are the risks for both people who are like, I'm gonna, order the parts and put this together myself and like whatever, and then kind of more largely, like I think the larger kind of thing that we haven't touched on is what are the risks for other forms of brain-computer interface? Is brain surgery no longer like, have we kind of perfected it enough that like things don't go wrong very frequently, or?
So I would say two things. In terms of neural stimulators and transcranial stimulation specifically, one of the devices that he showed, the Halo device, that's a neural stimulator. That's what that is. I mean, that's not on the market yet, I don't believe. but it's, I mean, it looks like a set of Beats headphones, and it creates a very low electrical current that stimulates the brain with the idea that, I mean, they say that they've shown 12% improvement in muscle, kind of muscular ability and kind of coordination. I mean, which is an it's a great performance enhancer if that's the case. They've shown similar things with concentration in terms of snipers and pilots, as you mentioned. The first time I tried a transcranial stimulator, it was using a 12-volt battery. So there is a big DIY area out there. Anybody that has a couple of electrodes and the right battery.
DIY.
Yeah, I mean, the risk, of course, is that you self-seizure, that you induce a seizure. You know, I mean, because what you're doing is you're affecting the firing rates of your neurons. What they say is that you're creating this, more fertile ground, and allowing the neurons to, fire or withhold more rapidly. But if you get that voltage wrong, and nobody quite knows what the correct voltage is, or if you get that voltage wrong, you risk giving yourself a seizure.
Has there been any interaction between bioengineers and medical people and digital scientists? I'm working with a medical device company and learning about cell signaling, and the brain naturally does miraculous things that we can't possibly do with digital technology. To what extent are the two interacting and talking to each other?
I think they're talking quite a bit. In terms of BCI, they're talking quite a bit. The question, that's a great question, though. It's one of the grand challenges. One of the people that I recount in my book, Andrew Schwartz, was working. He's one of the most gifted neuroscientists out there, and he talks about this moment when he was able to endow his research subject with 10 degrees of freedom in the arm, which is an extraordinary moment, right? But at a certain moment, she wouldn't be able to grab an object if she was looking at the object, and then she would close her eyes and she could grab the object, no problem, and everything was working just fine. But the question was, why is it that when she has this ability to control, is she unable to create this? It's a lot to explain, but basically, it's getting into this question of our very consciousness and how it is that we perceive the world. Are we somehow so close? Is our consciousness so closely associated with our ability to move that if we can't actually have that feedback, are we unable to move in that respect? And but let me just say this: in that respect, how do you translate that into computer science and a traditional computing system? It's a very complicated, and there's not one person that's kind of that's why the collaboration is so key.
But it may not be about computer science. It may be what the body can do all by itself with remote ischemic conditioning. You would want to tell one little group of mitochondria and not to have a problem with ischemic disorder, and the whole body gets fixed.
It's possible.
Another question? Let's go here. Thanks.
Could you explain a little about the actual physical connection on the implant model? Where the neurons, how they actually connect to the semiconductor?
Sure. So normally the setup. So there are a couple of different ways, but the most traditional implant is it's called the Utah array or the BlackRock array, and it's about the size of, say, a Tic Tac, and it has 100 separate electrodes on it, and it kind of sits like a bed of nails. And there are a couple of ground electrodes, so I think there's 96 total that are actual functioning electrodes. That is then pressed into the it's pneumatically pressed into the brain matter, and each one of those electrodes is in close proximity to 1, 2, possibly 3 separate neurons. that's connected by gold wires to a pedestal that exits the brain. When signals come off the brain, they're analog, so they have to be digitized, and then they have to be amplified, and then they have to be sent into a computer, where computer scientists have created an algorithm that will correlate these neural activities to whatever the end device is, be it a computer cursor or be it a robotic arm or what have you. And of course you have to, the brain can shift up to 2 millimeters in the brain case, and neurons themselves will shift. And so every day you have to actually calibrate that, the technologies to make sure that, if I'm moving up and to the right, this neuron is still going to fire at 67 hertz as opposed to the 70 hertz that was firing last week. And so it's it usually takes 2 or 3 PhDs to run one of these rigs. They're working. I mean, obviously, that's another huge hurdle that they have to get past. Not only that the interface itself needs technicians to be able to function that way, but also you ultimately want this to be wireless.
Alan?
It seems from the description of the electrodes, they almost sound like torture devices at this point. So the technology, it's in infancy. And to me, it seems like one of the bigger challenge is on the detection, the input device, and also on the stimulation devices. So where is the technology going as far as on the detection and on the stimulation
When you
points?
say detection,
Electrode, for instance.
Like
Where-
seizure detection, or?
Electrical signal detection.
signal from the neuron.
Whether wireless, wired, where it's actually physically implanted, is there alternative to a bed of nails piercing the brain?
There has to be a better way, right?
Well, like
I mean,
hydrophoresis devices.
well, one of the things that people are working on right now, and one of the things that a lot of neuroprosthetists are really excited about is optogenetics, which is a gene therapy that would allow cells to be controlled by you expose it to a certain frequency of light, and so there's specific cells that have been modified, specific neurons have been modified when light, so you can shine light through certain specific areas of the brain. When you shine the light, it'll go wherever it goes, but only this specific cell or class of modified cells will activate with that. It's a much more, they would say, elegant way of interacting with the brain, because when you're trying to stimulate with electricity, the electricity will move through the brain. This will allow you to focus on specific cells. How close is that? That's very far off.
What about genetically engineered neurons?
Let's follow up after. To the back here.
This would be constant.
I have a question about that site, and I wonder to what degree it comes up in some of the conversations we've had, or even the announcements in the lab, for instance, where you were talking about the possibility of mutual recognition as a kind of hypothetical or at least a idea that some scientists are moving towards. But cognition is not just in the brain, it's also, let's say, it's an embodied experience. So let's say different kind of body experience, even people experience it differently. A raised body versus a differently raised body will not experience the same experience. So they say, wait, what does it even mean to say that we share cognition in any way?
I'm sorry, I didn't totally.
So was the crux of the question that there's differences between different people's bodies, and then how do we share
They're not
cognition?
physical differences, they are cultural differences.
Okay.
So for instance, way certain kinds of bodies are perceived as raised bodies, as different, or gendered bodies, alters from body to body, right? That's the experience we have. So kind of the body notion of cognition, not just kind of brain notion of cognition. So to what degree can we even ethically talk about the possibility of sharing?
That's a fascinating question.
Because we talk about that, but it's interchangeable data. Although
Right.
it's truly
Right. That's a great question. I think that in terms of being able to share kind of across cultures and what or genders or what have you, a lot of the people that I've worked with would say, I may think, I may consciously consider, have a specific train of thought, or I may consciously imagine something to be, X, Y, or Z, but in neural space, that's going to look very different than what, than the consciousness that arises from that neural space. So my consciousness as, a Western man in the 21st century in the United States, that may, I may be, considering the world in a very different way than, I would have 100 years ago. But that the kind of the neural architecture that gives me those thoughts, that allows those thoughts to actually kind of emerge, remains largely unchanged, and is largely unchanged across culture, across gender. So when we're talking about sharing thoughts, when we're talking about creating impressions, we're talking about neural activity that is below the surface of thoughts, below that level. I don't know that answers your question, but that's.
No, I just think it's interesting because we started with something like wild that there's a switch between thinking and the mechanics, which
very much.
and they're not necessarily the same, even though we get caught up in using this new language.
Yeah, I think that's, someone asked earlier, do you make a distinction between brain and mind? And that's the distinction I would make, actually, is, I'm talking about the brain specifically. And what we're talking about when we're talking about culture or gender or culture gender is, that's the realm of the mind, I would say. I would guess.
Wonderful. Let's go here. So if you had a Utah array that was much more dense, say a million electrodes, what do you think that would be most efficacious way to use that would be in terms of neocortex?
So one of the ways that people are working with is trying to create a full body exoskeleton to do that. Because you have to get into kind of the deeper brain structures. You need to think about balance, and you need to think about all of these subcortical processes. I think if you have that sort of clarity of a million, I don't know that we actually know what we'd really be capable of. My sense is that we get into areas of really being able to restore memory and to approximate real vision.
We have time for one last question, and then we have till 8:30 to talk outside informally. Thank you so much for.
Let's go way to the back here.
We have a project called Brain Backups that enables connective imaging at the neuron level.
Could you speak up? Sorry. Thanks.
So we're working on full brain connective imaging. So there are 86 billion neurons in the human brain. You only have 3 billion bases in your DNA genome. So, one of the interesting things that happens when you work on this is you wonder, so how much computer storage is needed for the connective image? It's about 500 terabytes, depending on exactly how you compute it. And really one of the interesting things is that you can have a substrate independent mind. So you have 86 billion neurons and you can do it in another way. So I asked you, what would you do if you had a connective that you could put in your on your laptop or in your closet at home? Would you find that useful, or do you think only specialists would use
What
it?
sort of connectome?
Neuron by neuron. synapse
But
by
I mean,
synapse.
as I understand it, there are connectomes of specific, for specific memories, for specific experiences.
But at a particular point in time, your mind has one connectome.
Oh, you're talking about the entire connectome.
Yes.
What would I do with that? I might move toward trying to. I mean, wouldn't we then have achieved uploaded consciousness that the first question asked was?
No, not necessarily, because having the connector doesn't mean that you can simulate it faithfully or that you can do anything with it. So they're separate.
I don't know what I would do. What would you do?
Sounds like a great topic. Yeah, what would you do? Well, let's find that out over a few more drinks, hopefully. And, let's thank Malcolm.
I'd like to thank you both